How does Jesus break the rules and upset the religious leaders? In our text today, Mark 2:18-22, we see that Jesus is asked about fasting and he teaches about fasting. You see, his disciples aren't following the rules of traditional fasting. What's going on here? Jesus teaches that he's doing something new. Why is Jesus encouraging his disciples to break the traditional rules about fasting? Well, to answer that question, we're going to look at our text. We're going to read it first, Mark 2:18-22. Then we're going to mark it up and sort of investigate it, ask some initial questions. Next, we're going to look at the ESV study notes to see if any of those questions are answered in those notes. We're going to be doing a Greek word study on some important key words to see if that adds depth to our understanding. And then finally, we're going to answer the question, why does Jesus encourage his disciples to break these rules? We're going to take it home a little bit too and ask, what traditions or habits might Jesus be calling me to break as well? Let's jump in. Today, we're going to be looking at the ESV Study Bible for our reading. If you don't have your Bible turned to Mark already, that'd be a great time to turn to Mark 2, verses 18-22. Let's read. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins." This is the word of the Lord. As we start, we're going to circle anything unclear in blue like we normally do. Anything important, big ideas, verbs, repetition, that kind of thing is going to be in yellow. Anything cool, trivia level, not primary to our question, is going to be circled in green. Let's check out our text. All right, in our text, we see it is John's disciples and the Pharisees. We see the word disciples show up here. John's disciples, disciples of the Pharisees, disciples show up again there. So if we don't know what this word means, this seems like the first really mission critical word is disciples or disciple. What is a disciple and what does that word mean? Now we see disciples from two different groups are here, John and the Pharisees. Now that might be interesting to know the difference between the two groups. Historically, we know that John's disciples and the Pharisees' disciples were at odds. They didn't like each other. And so both of those groups are doing something together. Both of them are fasting. This is the second word that might be important if we don't know what it is. Fasting shows up here a few times there. Shows up there again here, fasting. And so finally here it shows up again. And again here. So it shows up a whole bunch of times. What does this word mean? Fast, fast, fast. And so what is a fast? What is Jesus' teaching on fasting? So that might be another word or an idea that we want to look up. What exactly is fasting? And Jesus then says something interesting about himself. He compares himself to a bridegroom. And a wedding guests are the disciples. The wedding guests aren't going to fast while the bridegroom is with them. So what exactly is going on here in this illustration? What is a bridegroom and why is Jesus comparing himself to a bridegroom? It's another question I got. Then we see that he starts to deviate from this bridegroom illustration to explain why the bridegrooms aren't fasting or why the guests aren't fasting while the bridegroom is with them. Well, obviously it's because one doesn't sew a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Wait, what, Jesus? What are you talking about? So we see that the guests are not fasting when the bridegroom is with them, but when the bridegroom is taken away, then that's when they fast. And to explain what Jesus means, he actually uses an illustration that we might not understand right away. So he says that no one takes an unshrunk cloth, meaning a new piece of cloth, and puts it on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, and a worse tear is made. So if you sew a piece of unshrunk cloth on a piece of shrunk cloth, then when the old cloth gets washed, it shrinks and it pulls on it. So it pulls away and it tears. It can tear the old garment, basically. To further explain this, then, Jesus goes on to an illustration that I think is a little bit more helpful for us. No one puts new wine, so what's new wine, into old wineskins. And these two types of wine are indicating the new thing Jesus is doing and the old thing the Pharisees are doing. If he puts the new wine into old wineskins, the wine bursts the skins, the wine is destroyed, so are the skins, but new wine is for fresh wineskins. So what exactly is Jesus saying here about the new wine and the old wine and the new wineskins and the old wineskins? A lot of interesting illustrations that we get to unpack today. So what's the deal with fasting? Why is Jesus using fasting as an example of breaking a tradition? Why do the Pharisees care so much? Why are John's disciples and the Pharisees both fasting? What does a bridegroom have to do with any of this? And how does a garment and a wineskin clear up the confusion? Honestly, there's a lot of good questions that we got to answer today. And hopefully by the end of the day, we can answer the ultimate question. What we're trying to answer is, why does Jesus break the rules about fasting, the traditional rules about fasting? What's going on here? Let's look at the ESV study notes to find out. All right, now we're going to look at the study notes in the ESV Study Bible down here. We're going to put these notes up on the screen so we can see them a little bit better. Let's go. Here we are in the ESV study notes, copied and pasted from BlueLetterBible.org. We'll go more into what that website is when we do the word study. So if we look at the study notes for Mark 2:18, fasting, it tells us to see another note in the study Bible, which I copied and pasted. So what is fasting? Well, if we look at the study notes from Mark 2:18, it points us to another section in Matthew where Jesus teaches about fasting. And we see in the study notes that the law required only one fast a year, which is interesting because in our text, Jesus doesn't break the law then. He's breaking a traditional rule. The disciples of John and of the Pharisees are fasting way more often than once a year. Jesus isn't breaking the law, though. In fact, he says, when you fast. Jesus assumes his disciples will fast. So then what's the point of fasting? Well, Jesus is saying, hey, the point isn't the law or the rule that is a tradition. There is an important law. So when you fast, do it to connect to God, to heighten spiritual sensitivity. And even today, fasting is really good. In fact, fasting from food, I'd say, is different than fasting from something like social media. And I would say it's different in a better way. So should we fast? I think so. Jesus assumes that his disciples will, and I think he would want us to as well. As we continue on to Mark 19 through 20, we see that Jesus refers to himself as the bridegroom. And so the bridegroom in the Old Testament, God the Father was the bridegroom. In Isaiah and Hosea, we see that. So then they will fast, meaning when the bridegroom leaves, when Jesus is taken away, that's when the disciples will fast. Fasting connects people to God in a special way, in a meaningful way. It heightens your spiritual senses. I don't know if you've ever experienced fasting, but it is a really cool experience. I definitely encourage you to try it out if you medically can. Don't force yourself into a dangerous position. But fasting is a pretty cool thing. And so Jesus assumes that his disciples are going to fast, but once he leaves, because he's right here, there's no reason to fast while he's right in front of them. They don't need to fast while Jesus is still with them. Wineskins and clothes. What on earth is Jesus talking about? Well, unshrunk clothes are new clothes, and new wine is new wine. Old garments are old, and old wineskins are old. So the kingdom of God is not merely a patch over the new Mosaic law and Jewish traditions. Jesus brings a new era with new ways. So the idea here is that when you would patch over an old garment with a new garment, that new patch of cloth would actually shrink. And as it would shrink, it would pull away from the old garment. Because the old garment was maybe a little bit brittle, it would actually tear. And so if you put on a new patch of cloth onto an old garment, you could actually tear your old garment. So what does wine have to do with it? Well, you would pour wine into these wineskins, and as the wine fermented, it would expand. Because the new wineskins were still stretchy, they were made from leather, the wineskins would expand with the wine as it expanded. If you used old wineskins like this, well, they would crack. And here we have a wineskin that is cracked and old. If a new wine went into this, it would explode. And you see a little bit of wine leaking out the bottom here. So old or new wine into an old wineskin ruins the bag, and it also ruins the wine. But if you put new wine into a new wineskin, it expands with the fermentation of the wine. That means the new thing that Jesus is bringing doesn't fit with the old traditions, doesn't fit with what the Pharisees are teaching. Jesus is bringing a new thing, and it requires a new wineskin. Are you going to be that wineskin? So we've learned a lot about our passage today, particularly about fasting and how fasting was really only required one day a year, although tradition held that it was to fast more often. Also, we've learned a little bit about the bridegroom, about the garments, about the new wine and the new wineskins. We're going to now go into a word study, investigate the original language, the Greek, and see if we can't learn a little bit more by looking at the Greek. The first word I think is going to be pretty important is fast and fasting. That's pretty much what the whole passage is about. And so even though we know what a fast is, likely, it'd be good to just check out the Greek to see if there's any nuance that we can see. Next word is disciples. Shows up a lot of times, and the disciples are the ones fasting. They're compared to the wedding guests as well. They're the ones doing the fasting. Seems like an important character to understand. The next section or word that we want to look up, I think, is bridegroom. This is a title that Jesus takes. Any title that Jesus takes seems like important enough to really know. The final word that we're going to look at is the word new. And so the word new shows up a few times, and also Jesus is bringing in a new thing. He's doing a new thing. It's the new wineskin, the new garment. So what is new mean? All right, let's go to Blue Letter Bible to do our word study. Here we are in BlueLetterBible.org. And if you want to learn how to set up BlueLetterBible.org and use this totally free resource to study the original languages of the Bible, the Greek and the Hebrew, also access free commentaries, a whole bunch of other stuff. It's all totally free. I have a video tutorial in the description below that can help you set this up. I actually set up already all the different words that we're going to be studying at the top here along the top. So let's just get started with our very first word. Our first word from our study in Mark is nestuo, or fast, and this is to abstain as a religious exercise from food and drink, either entirely if the fast lasted but a single day, or from customary and choice nourishment if continued for several days. Like in the case of Daniel, he had some food, but also the fast could be from food and drink, or just from drink. A lot of different ways to fast. The point of a fast is to gain connection to God, to have a little bit more spiritual awareness. And when I fasted, that's definitely something that I'd experienced. If you're able to fast, I definitely encourage it. Don't encourage it if you can't medically fast. But if you do fast, food fasting is, I think, different and more profound than fasting from something like social media. So if you haven't ever fasted and you're able to, I would definitely recommend giving it a shot. Our next words are pretty straightforward. First, we have mathetes, and this is a learner or pupil or disciple, meaning someone who is a disciple is a learner or pupil. Next word is nymphios, and this is a bridegroom. Of all 16 times that it's used in the New Testament, it is translated as bridegroom every time. That is a groom, someone who's about to be married, a male who's about to be married. Then we have the word new. And again, these are pretty basic words. New. New just means new. Kainos means new. And then the other word for new that's used is indeed young or new. So other than that, let's see if we can put it all together and answer, why is Jesus breaking the rules about fasting? How is Jesus disrupting the status quo and breaking the tradition of the Pharisees? Well, we see in Mark 2:18-22 that the disciples of the Pharisees and John's disciples are fasting. Jesus' disciples aren't fasting. And when he's asked about this, Jesus says, hey, listen, when the bridegroom is with the wedding guests, they cannot fast. But when the bridegroom is taken away, that is when they're going to fast. Meaning, fasting is for mourning, and fasting is connecting to God in a meaningful way. When you're with Jesus, you don't need to mourn, and you're already connected with God, so you don't need to fast. Plus, The Levitical code says you only need to fast 1 day a year, the Day of Atonement. The Pharisees have added all these extra fasts, weekly fasts even, where you need to follow this legally just because of legalism and tradition, and it has nothing to do with the heart behind the law. Then Jesus says, I'm going to do something totally new, and it's not going to work with your tradition. Like the example of fasting, that's not the real heart behind the law. All the legalism, Pharisees, it's not going to work. Just like if you took an unshrunk piece of cloth and attached it to an old garment, meaning a new piece of cloth is used as a patch, and if you put the patch on the old garment, when the new patch shrinks, it rips away from the old garment because the old garment is already shrunk. And so you're going to make the rip worse. Or if you take new wine and you put it into old wineskins, the old wineskins are already expanded. Wineskins expand, and when new wine is fermenting, it actually expands the wineskin. So you need to put new wine into new wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, the wine's going to be ruined, and so are the skins. So the new wine needs to go into fresh wineskins. Jesus is doing something brand new. And because he's doing something brand new, it's not going to work with the legalism and the tradition of the Pharisees. Jesus is doing something new. In Mark 2:18-22, we see that the new wine goes into the new wineskin, not the old. We need to examine our hearts. Are our hearts the old wineskins? Are they trapped by legalism? Are they trapped by tradition? Are they trapped by ritual? Or are they new? Are they prepared? Do we put grace over law? Do we put healing over ritual? Are we ready for the new thing that Jesus has for us? So I would ask you, are you ready for the new thing that Jesus has for you? Is your heart a new wineskin, or are you trapped in the old?
Eat your word.